Everybody knows that there are certain things in this world that are just plain boring. Taxes, stocks, anything having to do with court, and stuff of that nature are rather infamous for being used to help insomniacs fall asleep. So one might naturally assume that any story that has to do with these topics would also be boring to watch by default. But, as many a court drama has proven, that simply isn't true. Though it is true that boring topics can make for a boring movie if not handled correctly. Looking at you, United Passions. But that being said, there has been many a movie that has famously taken concepts that would come across as the dullest movie ever on paper and have made them into some of the best, or at least entertaining, films out there. And today, I'd like to go over a couple of movies that pulled this off perfectly. Now, there are going to be spoilers for most of the movies mentioned, so in case there's something you don't want ruined, you might just want to keep on the lookout. I'll be giving out no other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so to start off simply, many movies with an inherently boring concept behind them often take the same approach that TV shows for little children do. Which is to say, they make the concept fun to watch or learn about. Like how Sesame Street tries to make counting, reciting your ABCs, or learning about other concepts fun, many movies with boring premises will use the same technique, keeping in mind that they usually have a much older target audience, obviously. And one of the best examples I can give for that is actually My Cousin Vinny. Because what a lot of people don't realize about this movie is that for all its hilarity, it's actually one of the most accurate court movies out there. Sure, the situations are hilarious, but they're also presented exactly how those same situations would play out if you tried to pull some of the stunts Vinny does in real life. In fact, this movie is actually a favorite among law school teachers, specifically because it does such an effective job of showing what the life and rules of a lawyer are like, while also being entertaining and something that will keep their students' attention. To put it simply, because Vinny is learning as he goes, it allows the audience to learn about how court really works along with him. Everything he learns about lawyer-to-lawyer relations, how evidence is handled, how best to question witnesses. These are all things a real lawyer needs to learn how to do. But instead of the entire movie just sitting around lecturing the audience on this stuff, it instead chooses to get all of this across while being really funny. And what also helps is that the movie is most definitely a comedy first, with the more educational aspects just sprinkled in here and there, rather than being the point of the movie in the first place. And because of that, it makes the movie pretty fun to watch, to the point that the audience finds themselves potentially learning something without even realizing it. Because all those scenes of exposition are played for laughs, and because the movie does such an effective job of being funny, both when it is and isn't trying to get a point across, it never actually feels like it's trying to convey anything. And honestly, sometimes that's the best way to get topics like that across. Or another good example of this would be Trading Places, famously using the stock market as a major plot point, particularly at the end when our two main characters manipulate it in order to ultimately triumph over the Dukes. This is another movie that can teach the viewer a few things without them realizing it. Though unlike My Cousin Vinny, This is more a case of the movie getting across certain things about the stock market to the audience because it has to, so that they'll understand how some aspects of the movie work, rather than deliberately trying to teach them anything. But that being said, it could still work as a good introductory course to people trying to learn about the stock market. And its accuracy hasn't gone unnoticed by people in the business, as a bill was actually nicknamed the Eddie Murphy Law because it was specifically designed to make illegal what the Dukes try to do and what Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd succeed in doing in the movie. The point is, that's how accurate what they were doing applied to real life. But again, in this case, the movie is definitely a comedy that simply has more educational aspects to it because of things inherent to the plot. But that doesn't mean it still doesn't do an excellent job of taking stuff that would normally be dead boring and making it the base for some pretty hilarious situations. But if you're looking for an example closer to My Cousin Vinny in its ability to actively teach the audience about the stock market while being entertaining, then look no further than Wall Street. Though not a comedy, this movie manages to make something as complex and boring as the stock exchange not only easy to understand, but actually make for a rather engaging and effective drama to boot. And it mainly does this by making sure to explain the more confusing aspects of it rather thoroughly, but also make sure not to overdo those explanations and simply get across what the audience needs to know, as well as making sure there's actual stakes involved so that the viewer will care about what's going on and want to understand the finer details. And Oliver Stone pulled this off so effectively that not only did it teach a lot of people about the stock market, but inspired a whole generation to become stockbrokers. Just by dumbing down the concept a bit and giving the proper explanations when needed, Stone was able to convince thousands of young people who probably would have never otherwise considered it to go into that field. Though, let's face it, a career-defining performance by Michael Douglas as the legendary and charismatic Gordon Gekko, as well as the prospect of being able to become rich overnight if you play your cards correctly, probably had a lot to do with that too. But that first point only proves my point further. Douglas, with help from Stone's genius writing, took what could have been just a corrupt stockbroker and turned him into one of the most famous villains of the latter half of the 20th century, simply because they knew how to work the character so that audiences would be left mesmerized by him. And there have even been movies that managed to teach things unintentionally, like the famous 1966 science fiction movie Fantastic Voyage. And let me just save time by saying, I'm pretty sure I learned more about human biology watching this movie than over 12 years in school. But the impressive thing here is, that's not the point of the movie at all. This movie was simply made for the special effects, to be able to realistically depict a miniature submarine going inside the human body, and all of the strange and bizarre things the people inside that submarine would see. It's just that in order to understand the movie, and for it to have an exciting plot, a lot of things about how the body works end up having to be explained to the audience, whether it's to increase tension, make a detour, or simply to explain to them what it is they're actually seeing. And because of that, the audience actively welcomes these explanations because they're so invested in the story. And as a result, this movie is often shown in schools just like My Cousin Vinny, because it not only does a great job of explaining these things, but also provides pretty accurate visuals to help certain concepts and phenomenons of the human body be explained to students. In other words, for a movie that was made solely for the special effects, it does a frankly amazing job of teaching the audience how the body works without it ever coming across that way. But of course, there are other movies to have done this even more with less to work with, like 12 Angry Men, considered one of the greatest movies of all time. Because the point of the movie is simply to show how a jury should seriously consider the responsibility they've been given and debate all the facts before giving a verdict in court. And how does the movie make it watchable? Well, mainly by having dialogue so excellent, it was probably where Quentin Tarantino learned how to write so well, but also by simply making the characters human. To put it simply, despite the fact that the characters are literally only referred to by numbers, the movie goes out of its way to emphasize that these are real, ordinary people who just happened to be picked for jury duty. And because of that, the audience finds themselves naturally drawn to them, as they feel like normal people you might want to sit and chat with while waiting for the bus. And that is what makes their deliberation interesting to listen to, especially because the audience only finds out anything about the case through those same jury members, which adds even more interest to their conversation. Because naturally the audience wants to know the details of the case, so at first they'll be interested in what they're saying for that alone. To put it simply, the writers smartly don't depict the trial first, because they know that finding out everything secondhand through the jury members will make the movie more interesting, on top of thematic reasons as well. And not to mention, the writers managed to add just enough stakes to keep the viewer invested in it. I mean, sure, it is their job to decide if an 18-year-old kid is guilty of murder or not, so you'd expect the audience to be invested for that reason alone. But because we don't get any details on him one way or the other, or even get to see what he looks like, it makes it a bit hard for the audience to really care at first. But as more doubt is cast upon his guilt, it increases the tension of what the jury members will decide, which is kind of the whole point of the movie. Because that's the number one rule of a courtroom jury. If there is a reasonable doubt, then they must be acquitted. But the main question throughout the movie is it reasonable enough? And while all of that is going on, they also managed to add in smaller, more personal stakes for the characters as well, such as the room getting too hot, one of the jurymen wanting to make it to a baseball game, and the movie climaxing with juryman number 3 realizing he's taking the anger and resentment he feels towards his son out on a potentially innocent kid that has nothing to do with his problems. And honestly, it makes for a much more effective ending than you'd think, specifically because of the subtle build-up, and because it's something that could believably happen in real life. Though seriously, you know a movie is doing something right when the audience feels immense satisfaction from the simple action of a fan finally turning on because it was simply made that clear how hot the characters were, to the point that the viewer can practically feel the heat themselves. And there are even rare cases where a movie manages to be entertaining despite a seemingly boring setup without wanting to teach the audience anything. And a good example of this would be Amadeus, as the movie actually had trouble finding a financer because most movie studios thought a 3-hour semi-biopic about Mozart, an 18th century composer, would be extremely boring. But the final result not only managed to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, but it's also considered to be an absolute masterpiece by many, myself included. Though, by all accounts, this movie should be dead boring, and yet the writers managed to turn it into a story that never loses your attention. I mean, granted, it did have to invent a rivalry between Mozart and Antonio Salieri in order to do that, but I've never been one to complain about a movie's deviations from reality, especially when it leads to results like this. Though if I'm being honest, I believe a major reason this movie works so well lies in F. Murray Abraham's performance. The way he makes Salieri both sympathetic and unsympathetic, tortured, brilliant, intelligent, bitter, passionate, and jealous all at the same time is simply amazing. Especially the way Salieri feels such a burning envy towards Mozart, yet also can't help but admire the man, and how it tortures him to no end cannot be overstated. Seriously, there are so many layers to this character that I could go on for hours if I wanted to, and the way Abraham brings them to life is really the pinnacle of acting. Every time Salieri is on screen, especially as an older man narrating the story, he's just so magnetic that you can't take your eyes off him. In fact, I might even go as far as to say that Abraham's performance here might just be one of the best in all of cinema, and definitely deserve to win the Academy Award for Best Actor. But that isn't to say that Abraham is solely to credit for the success of the movie, because as I mentioned before, the way it's written and the liberties it takes with history make for a much more engaging narrative than if the movie had been a much straighter, accurate depiction of Mozart's life. And as I also said before, any and all changes made in the name of telling a better story were definitely for the best here, as it both made for a truly magnificent movie, but it's also not like the movie ever claimed to be accurate to real life anyway. But honestly, the point here is that if a movie is to be exciting, no matter the premise or starting point, it has to have a story that will keep the viewer's attention. Because just like Amadeus, Barry Lyndon, for example, seems to have the exact same problem at first, being an almost 3-hour-long movie about a man trying to climb the European hierarchy in the 18th century. And yet, Stanley Kubrick similarly manages to keep the audience's interest the entire time. But then again, this is Stanley Kubrick we're talking about. And considering the man knew how to make great movies, that shouldn't really be too surprising. Alright, so as I went over before, when you really get down to it, it's not actually the concept behind movies themselves, but rather what a writer decides they want to do with them that determines how boring or exciting it'll be. Because all of the previous examples prove just because something is generally considered boring doesn't mean that it has to be presented that way. And as those movies show, there's honestly a ton of ways to make seemingly uninteresting stuff interesting, whether it's to teach the audience something or just because it's a part of the movie's setting. It's all pretty much the reverse of bad action movies that bore the audience with their dull plots. It all depends on how it's presented to the viewer. But as a man who's written books myself, I'll just say that the hardest part of getting and retaining the interest of the audience is to make them care about what's going on and keep them feeling that way, which is something that all of those movies managed to pull off with flying colors. So if you can do that, as well as make your idea at least somewhat entertaining, then pretty much anybody can take any idea, no matter how boring it may seem, and turn it into a story that has the audience's interest in it the whole time. Okay, I think that was everything I wanted to cover. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Which movie have you seen that you believe did the best job of making a boring topic interesting? And do you think it's something that generally is hard to pull off, or not? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And remember, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel any way you want to about anything discussed here. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate all of it. And I hope to see you all next time.